I have recently heard multiple European politicians say that what's important now is that we get the US back on board, that we smooth things over between Trump and Zelensky, that we get everyone back to the negotiating table so that we can move forward together. But I don't get it. I don't know what the point is. Why do we think that is important? Why do we think that this would be a good thing? I think we have to start by looking at what Ukraine and Europe want to get out of it, what outcome they're hoping for, what the goals are. Of course, Ukrainian and European interests are not identical, but they're quite closely aligned. For Ukraine, the situation is clearly more severe and urgent. They're currently being invaded, their cities are being bombed, their people are being killed. Obviously, they would like the death and destruction to stop, but they would also like to restore their territorial integrity. It's not just about getting back the land that was taken, but also about liberating the people that are now living under occupation. So ideally, they would like to defeat Russia and get their land and people back. They also want some sort of security guarantees. That's the second goal. They want to know that the war will not just start again in a few years. And an important point is that it matters that there doesn't just happen not to be another war. It's important that peace is predictable. That's how those who fled the country can know that it's safe to return and that it makes sense to rebuild and invest in the country. So that's how they can have a future. For Europe more broadly, the threat is less immediate and less existential, but they basically want the same things. So why does Europe want Ukraine to win? Well, this kind of thing, bigger countries invading and conquering their neighbors, it wasn't supposed to happen. It's not supposed to be an option. So it's important that this invasion does not succeed, that it doesn't pay off, that this kind of behavior is not rewarded. And so it's also in the interest of Europe that Ukraine wins as much as possible. Ideally, if Ukraine can outright defeat Russia, then the invasion will have been for nothing, and Russia will have paid a huge price in terms of casualties and a crumbling economy, with nothing to show for it. This is a different perspective, but the outcome is the same. The goal is still the same. And from this perspective, just winning is a kind of security guarantee, in the sense that it discourages this kind of behavior and makes other wars less likely. So this kind of covers the second goal as well. But what about explicit security guarantees, specifically for Ukraine? This war has been costly for Europe. It's been destabilizing, both politically and economically, and Europe has had to invest a lot of resources into supporting Ukraine. So it's in their interest that this doesn't keep happening. But it's not because it's an inconvenience. If Russia is able to chip away at Ukraine, one piece at a time, they may eventually be in control of all of Ukraine, or at least a large chunk of it. And at that point, it's suddenly a much more immediate threat to other countries as well, like Moldova or the Baltics. So for both Ukraine and Europe more broadly, it matters how peace is achieved. And it matters that there is long-term peace. And like I said, that it's a predictable peace, that everyone can have some level of assurance or confidence that the war won't restart. Okay, so why be skeptical of encouraging US involvement? Well, the US has different goals. Trump has made it very clear that all he cares about is stopping the war. It has to stop. But that's not necessarily compatible with the Ukrainian and European goals. Stopping the war is great, but that in itself doesn't say anything about how it stops or what happens after. Trump has said that he doesn't want to take sides, that he doesn't want Ukraine to have an advantage. He is also completely uninterested in talking about, much less providing, security guarantees. Well, there's the mineral deal, but let's talk about that some other time. So, the American position is completely contrary to both of the goals that Ukraine and Europe share. This means that getting the Americans back on board can't just mean that we agree to negotiate together. It means they have to be convinced to adopt certain goals as well. That we can agree to pull in a certain direction. So they have to agree not just to participate, but to participate in a certain way. And that seems quite far-fetched to me. And here's why. They have not been persuaded by the moral case. You could simply say that what is happening is wrong. There is an aggressor and a victim. And especially considering all the war crimes, it would seem that the right thing to do, at the very least, is to help the victim defend itself. But America is not convinced. At least not the America we have today. They also haven't been persuaded by an appeal to self-interest. The war is a problem for Europe, and it could be a much bigger problem in the future, if it's not dealt with appropriately. And the US could find itself in a similar position. Imagine that Russia takes over Ukraine. Some years later, Russia invades the next country. This would probably be a NATO member. So technically, the US would be supposed to participate at that point, and would then find itself actually fighting a war, rather than being able to participate from the sidelines, at a distance. Well, maybe they ignore Article 5 and don't bother, which has started sounding increasingly plausible lately. At the very least, trade would now be interrupted. And what if Russia takes over Europe? Then will it affect America? I mean, Zelensky raised this issue during their argument in the Oval Office, and Trump completely dismissed it. So this argument is not effective. I also made the point earlier that if this kind of behavior is rewarded, others may feel emboldened, leading to more wars. And pointing out that China is observing and taking notes is pretty popular. I don't think China worries very much about the consequences of invading Taiwan, what the response would be, based on the precedent that we have been setting in the case of Russia and Ukraine. But this clearly hasn't been convincing either. America also hasn't been persuaded by an appeal to principles or values. I thought we, in the West, shared certain values: democracy, freedom, the rule of law. And here we have a democracy in an existential battle against an authoritarian regime, fighting for its freedom. Are these things not worth defending? I thought the America I knew was willing to stand up for and defend these values. Another value I thought we shared was the international rules-based order that was established after the Second World War. I thought we agreed that we reject might makes right and that we no longer move borders by force. But Trump very clearly takes precisely the opposite position. He does believe in might makes right. And we see a mountain of evidence for it. We see it in the way he talks about Panama, Canada, and Greenland. We see it in the way negotiations started, where he called Putin and arranged a meeting that excluded both Ukraine and Europe. He must either have been unaware, somehow, that there are other interests involved, or he must have thought that those interests don't count, that they don't matter, and don't deserve to be represented. When asked whether Russia would have to give back any of the occupied territory, he said that they fought for it. So Trump clearly subscribes to a worldview with spheres of influence, where might makes right, and where bigger countries get together and decide the fate of smaller countries. But the appeal to values also has an aspect of self-interest to it. It's not just Europe that has to worry about stability locally, pretty much everyone everywhere should want to uphold the post-World War II order. It's what has allowed the peace and stability and prosperity that we have enjoyed during these decades. Because we can all play a positive sum game, where we trade and cooperate, which makes everyone better off. The alternative is a negative sum game, the law of the jungle, every man for himself. This might sound good if you happen to be the biggest around, and you can just take what you want, so you can benefit from it. But what happens when that's no longer the case? And what happens when you piss off enough smaller players that they eventually get together to stand up to you? You can only benefit if you can assure that you're always and forever at the top, which you can't. So you can only benefit temporarily. It should be in America's own interests to uphold these values, to defend the rules-based order. But Trump doesn't see it that way. So getting America to care about the outcome, to adopt goals that are aligned with the goals of Ukraine and Europe, that seems quite far-fetched. And if we look at the outcome so far, it's not looking promising. What has US involvement accomplished? At least since the Trump administration got involved. Well, right off the bat, they have made at least 2 important concessions before the negotiations have even really started. NATO membership for Ukraine and Ukraine getting back its territory. These were both taken off the table immediately, giving Ukraine a much weaker starting position. And then military aid and intelligence sharing were stopped. This has weakened Ukraine on the battlefield, which then also translates into a weaker negotiating position. So it's not just that the US has opposite goals conceptually, but they have also translated them into achieving the opposite outcome in practice. Rather than helping defend Ukraine, they are holding its hands behind its back and blindfolding it, while Russia keeps punching. So again, I wonder, why do we think America should be involved? What makes anyone think they could be convinced to adopt compatible goals? And if that's not possible, then what is the point? There are essentially 2 options. Either help Ukraine or force Ukraine to capitulate. And Trump has stated explicitly, and also demonstrated by his actions, that he is not interested in helping. But Ukraine does not need help to capitulate. They can do that completely on their own. So then what's the point? Trump says the Europeans should take care of Europe so that America can pivot to China. Sounds good to me. Why not just let Trump focus on China and maybe figure out his tariffs or something?